Thank you very, very much. And I'm very honored and very pleased to be here, thanks to the Siemens Foundation and also Humboldt-University. As Professor Macho just said, it's the university where someone I spent a lot of time thinking about Hegel taught, and it's always had a very special, there's a room over there I know where Hegel used to teach, and I've been in that room and felt the vibrations there. And I feel them here again. So I'm very glad to be here to talk to you about this issue, which is a really big issue in our world. I'm talking about what it means to say that our Western democratic societies, or sometimes people say democratic societies in general, ought to be secularist. Or if we're speaking, this happens in two languages because a certain number of countries like France and Italy and Spain and Turkey have this other word, laicité or laiklik in Turkish, or which is the word that they use, and they're not quite exactly translations of each other, but still they're pointing to the same basic issues. And what I'd like to do tonight is propose two ways of understanding what these issues are. Why do we need, and I think we do need, secularist regimes in diverse liberal societies? Two ways of looking at why we need them and what the issues are, and I will, of course, very strongly take a position for one of them rather than the other, so it isn't going to be a neutral, value-free discourse. It's going to be very much my own position. And I think we can define these two understandings of secularism in terms of what they're seen as doing, what they're designed for. Why do we need such a regime? Now, there's one view that says that we need a regime of that kind, which involves separation of church and state and a non-alignment of the state with any particular religion, because we need in a liberal society somehow to control religion, to make sure it keeps to its proper place. And this is the kind of view that you could easily take if you looked at the history of, for instance, French laïcité, the famous law of 1905 on la séparation de l'Église et de l'État. You can see there from the whole way in which it was conceived that the big problem was the place of the Catholic Church and how to somehow keep it from invading totally the Republic and give it and confine it to a certain space. So that's what, let me call that, and maybe that's somewhat unfair of me, but let's call that the control model, religion control model. That's one model. The other model, which also goes back a long time, is what I want to call the diversity model. And there, the big problem that secularist regimes are meant to deal with is the issue of how to deal with a diverse society, which is also a democratic society, and as a democratic society has to be a society founded on equality. So how to somehow cope with diversity in the context of democracy and equality of different citizens, that's the big problem that the second concept, the second idea, sees secularism as dealing with. So let's call them the control model, religion control model, and the diversity model. What are our goals? What are the principles we're trying to operate on? What are we trying to maximize? And I think you can do this in 2 or 3 or 4. I'll propose to you three principles, 3 goals, which I think secularist regimes are trying to, or ought to be trying to, maximize. Number 1, the freedom of conscience of everyone, religious or non-religious or anti-religious, to act out their own convictions. I mean, it may be wearing a headscarf if you're some kind of Muslim, or maybe wearing a kippah if you're some kind of Jew, or maybe wearing a cross, or maybe doing something totally different if you're not of any religion, but freedom of conscience is one of the basic principles. The second principle is equality between citizens of whatever view they might have about religion, non-religion, or anti-religion. They all are equal citizens of the society, which means that the society itself, the state itself, can't be aligned with any of these views. And the third principle is a principle about, if you like, politics rather than the law. It's the principle that we ought to try to ensure that all the different metaphysical, religious, anti-metaphysical, anti-religious positions are equally heard when it comes to deciding big issues of how we should live together. In other words, all these voices should somehow be in the debate. Things like the separation of church and state and the neutrality of the state are very, very slippery concepts which need to be interpreted in each given context. And the basic way of thinking of my second model is that we should define the separation of church and state, and we should define neutrality in the light of these three goals. That is, the way, the institutional structures that best meet the three goals ought to be the ones that we will define as separation of church and state. Now, why do I favor this second view over the first? Well, I think there are two very, very big advantages which flow from it. Number one is when you lay out the three goals, as I've just done, it's clear that they can conflict. They're different goals, and in certain situations, they can enter into tension with each other. In other words, we can see right away that there can be dilemmas, big dilemmas, which we have somehow to resolve. I mean, take a very discussed case, which is very discussed in Canada and the commission I was on. It has been discussed in France, has been raised in Germany. The issue of young girls in schools, Muslim girls wearing a hijab, right? And as you know, this has been denied in the French schools. In Germany, if I understand it rightly, of course, it depends on the different Länder, but in some Länder, I don't think there's any land which has were forbidden schoolgirls from wearing the hijab, but some have said that teachers, female Muslim teachers who ought to wear the hijab, should not be allowed to do that in the classroom. And then in other cases, such as the UK, for instance, that stay within Europe, there is no general rule against either teachers or students. Now, what's going on here? Why are there different reactions here? Well, because people feel, I think underlying all this, that there is a dilemma here. On one hand, you have the value, the goal of freedom of conscience. And that would tell you to accept or to allow this wherever people wanted to wear it, felt they had to wear it, felt it was part of their exercise of their religion to wear it. On the other hand, you have this sense that, after all, institutions like public schools are public institutions. They belong to the state. They are they're there to serve all of us. These institutions have in some way not to be aligned, to be neutral, right? So that's why people hesitate to follow their first instinct, which might be looking at freedom to say, let them do it. They say, well, no, we have to have a neutral school system, so we must forbid it. And whereas you can get all sorts of solutions here, the solution you have in certain German Länder is that, all right, we let the kids do it, the school children do it, but after all, people argue, teacher is a kind of authority figure, and therefore we can't let the teachers do it. Well, now, just to let you in on, I mean, part of the thinking for this comes from a commission we had in Quebec between 2007 and 2008 about all these issues, and our conclusion was that both should be allowed to wear it. I mean, we didn't take as ultimately valid the argument that teachers are authority figures and therefore they shouldn't wear it, because we argued on the other direction on that. We said, look, we want to bring these children up in a world in which they're going to be surrounded by very, very diverse religious positions. And they better learn that quite early on, that some teachers will have a veil and some won't. I mean, a very small minority like you have a veil, but they will have a veil and some won't, and that's the world that they're living in. So we decided against that. But you can see that you need an argument here. You need an argument because you're faced with what at first blush is a dilemma. And you need to work it out. And you need not only to work it out, but probably you'll work it out differently in different situations because the contours of different situations, the pressures of different countries and so on are going to be different. So it's not likely that we'll ever have a single agreed answer to this dilemma across all the different democratic jurisdictions of the West, right? So, but the important thing is to recognize that there are two principles here and there's a dilemma. The problem with conceptions like laïcité, as it very often is, or like the separation of church and state, as it very often is presented, is that it's presented as the obvious answer to this before you've even asked the question. And people ask things like, well, what solution is more purely laïque? What are we looking, if you take this model, what does it really require in the end? If you think of the ideal point, which we'll never reach, where it's fully, as it were, operative, it would be a world in which we come together as a majority in a society around certain basic principles, the principles of human rights and equality, and the secularist regime as described in the second model would be part of those principles, would be integral part of those principles. But this is not something which this is something we share, but we don't share the fundamental reasons why each of us, for his or her own part, accepts this. We accept that human beings have the right to life. The Christian will say this is because they're made in the image of God. The Kantian will say because they're rational beings. The utilitarian will say because they are beings that can suffer and be happy, and therefore that's, they ought to be given this, and there's no reason to deny them this, and so on. So we will have this great variety of reasons spread out in the population for our coming together on these same principles. And there's something a little bit unsettling about this, because we've always been used in our history, in Christendom, to have the basic principles of the society anchored in what was understood to be the basic nature of the good. If you go back to 200 years, all our societies were confessional societies. I mean, talking about Europe now. I mean, the United States was already beginning to break out of that. But in Europe, in Germany, 2 confessions or 3 confessions, depending on how you count, in different areas of the country. So we lived in a world in which it seemed normal that the basic principles on which the state operates were grounded in generally accepted foundations. Lutheran here, Calvinist there, Catholic there, and so on, Anglican, etc. And it's very hard to move out of that. But this is what this second kind of secular regime requires. See, the first secularist regime doesn't yet move us out of that, because there's a certain version of Jacobinism which simply makes the Jacobin lay Enlightenment republicanism the religion of the state, right? It makes it the non-religion, but the common ideology of the state. So it's once more a kind of civil religion, which is dominant. And I think when you hear the debates in Paris around the Stasi Commission, you hear echoes of that idea still coming back. But that's something that can't be accepted if you take seriously this second model, right? So we're in a world in which the most fundamental principles of the state, we can hope, will be agreed by almost everyone, but for reasons that will be very different from one case to the next. And I think this is the only kind of stable democratic regime that we in the West could ever hope for. Now, if people want to say that there are certain conditions in which the disagreements are so great that we can't have that, then I don't see another democratic solution. But I think it would be much too early to conclude that in any of the cases of the Western world, Western Europe right through to the Americas, we're dealing with cases of this kind. I think on the contrary, this should be the model that we should embrace.